So welcome to my humble abode. My name is Will Cave. This has been my place of residence. Grave 3, Lot 8, no, Grave 8, Lot 3, Block 43 for the last 61 years. For the 82 years before that, I died in 1954, I was essentially a resident of Missoula for all those years. 82 years. Came to Missoula with my mother Caroline and my stepfather Alfred Cave in 1872. I was an 8-year-old boy, or actually 7-year-old boy, when we got here and settled here. I had been born in 1863, December of 1863, well, the story has always been I was the second white child born in Alder Gulch. Now, 1863, of course, was the year that gold was discovered in May of 1863 at Virginia City and Nevada City, etc. So I was born in December. Now, if you remember your Montana history, December of 1863, vigilantes, the road agents, the first hangings were actually at within sight of my home. Of course, I wasn't paying much attention at that time. In January of '64, they hung the vigilantes under Captain James Williams, hung Red Yeager and George Brown at what's now called Robbers Roost, down at the bottom of Alder Gulch. We called it the Luray Ranch, Laurin, which is today, as I rise from the grave, I've noticed that people, it's still a town down there on the Stinking Water or the Ruby River. The vigilantes were very much part of my DNA, I guess. Ironically, coincidentally maybe, my resting place here is almost within sight of the last mass hangings of the vigilantes 3 weeks later at Hellgate, when they came from Virginia City and Bannock to string up Alec Cartwright and the boys over here at Hellgate. Having been born in 1863, before Montana was actually Montana, we were in Idaho Territory. I don't know this for sure, but I may be the oldest Montana-born person in this cemetery. There may be some dispute, but I don't know. I'm sure I can be proven wrong. 1872 is when we arrived in Missoula. My dad was a packer, a freighter, and he bought 160 acres out by Target Range, but also the home on East Front Street where we lived basically the rest of my life, and my parents' life as well. As I say, I grew up with Missoula and with Montana essentially, and this portion of Montana. So I was vivacious and interested, curious teenager as all these things unfolded. 1877 was the Nez Perce War and the establishment of Fort Missoula. I was there for that. I was there when the first Northern Pacific train came through in 1883. Made a big impression on me and, of course, Missoula. I was there when the University of Montana opened its doors in 1995. By then, I had been appointed the first county auditor when the state legislature in 1891 established the position of county auditor. I was appointed by Governor Smith as Missoula County's first. I later served in other county offices as assessor, and Justice of the Peace, and a couple of other positions, and also had a state position as well as basically the orphanage department They called it the Humane Department, or Humane Society, something like that. I can't remember. That was later in life. The story I'd like to tell, and some of you may have already heard this, goes back to my days as a 13-year-old. We were established in Missoula. My dad, again, had pack trains and mules, and that was the summer that Fort Missoula was established. The first troops under Captain Ron came to Missoula. My story starts in May, the month before that, when the tribes had been over east of the mountains on their winter hunt. Now this was 1877. We probably know that the buffalo were all but gone. The bison were all but gone from the eastern plains by 1883 when the railroad came. But in 1877, there were still thousands of buffalo east, especially in the Yellowstone River country. And so the tribes, the Nez Perce and the Flatheads, in other words, the Salish and the Pend d'Oreille, were coming back from that winter's hunt, and they stopped, as they often did in Missoula, to before they parted company and went to their separate homelands. So we had, and I remember this well, I used to wander through the camps in this year and other years, and I classed the Nez Perce and the Flatheads as my friends as a young boy. The Nez Perce had established their camp on the south side of the river in Missoula. Essentially, as I wrote in my story of the Nez Perce War and the Big Hole Battle in 1921, they were 25 to 30 lodges, roughly on the South 5th East area. In 1921, they called it the circus grounds, somewhere near the university. And they were scattered in no particular form or fashion over to Orange Street, about the corner of First Street West on Orange Street. 25 to 30 lodges, I'm guessing maybe 200 or more people that were coming back from the buffalo hunt. Well, the Flatheads were also camped in Missoula, but they had picked the north side of the river, and their camp, a similar sized camp, stretched basically from the train station, where the train station became and is now, over to Rattlesnake Creek. So you had the Nez Perce on the south side of the Missoula River, as we called it, and the Flatheads, the Salish and Pend d'Oreille, and perhaps some Kootenai on the north side. This was a festive time for them. The buffalo hunt was done. They were coming home. They were parting ways. They were probably had traveled east together and spent the winter together. So what we had was a festival, and they spent every day. They stay in a 10-day stay. The popular pastimes were horse races. The women played the game of shinny, and there was gambling going on all the time. Now the horse races usually started late afternoon and went into the evening, and they often ended, or they almost always ended, with a long race, a 6-mile race, 3 miles out towards the confluence of the Bitterroot, and then 3 miles back. And most often the Nez Perce won these horse races, and most often the overall winner was a Nez Perce named Poker Joe. Poker Joe had a pinto horse, a paint horse, that was the fastest distance horse apparently in the camp. Now you may recognize the name Poker Joe by the fishing access up the Bitterroot. He was one of the Nez Perce families that actually lived over in the Bitterroot among the Salish in those times. He spent a lot of his time here and back and forth to the Idaho, to the Nez Perce grounds in Idaho and Oregon. He knew this country. Of course, the shinny game, and if you're familiar with the game of shinny, it's essentially field hockey, where we have a curved stick and you're batting, in this case, a leather-bound ball to another goal. In some cases, those fields were played, or the fields they played on were as much as a mile long. Now, I'm not sure how long this particular one was. I'm guessing it was over by the Nez Perce camp, because there wasn't anything else in Missoula on the south side of the river much in 1877, so there'd be a lot of open spaces. The Flathead women were usually the winners of the game of shinny. And this was going on in afternoons and evenings as well, but all during this time and late into the night, besides the dancing that took place in both camps at night, gambling was going on, and not only the stick game kind of gambling, I'm guessing, but cards. And Poker Joe was, as his name would indicate, often the winner of the card games. That's how he got his nickname. So 10 days are over, and the tribes, the camps, go their separate way. The Nez Perce heading over Lolo Pass and the Salish going up to the Bitterroot, and the Portrayed up to the Flathead Lake area, etc. Little did we know then, and I was just a boy of 13, but little did I know, and anybody else in Missoula know, that was going to be the last time we had such a festival, such a scene. 2 months later, the Nez Perce were coming back with the military in hot pursuit in July of 1877. Now, Fort Missoula had just been established in the interim. Captain Ron and others were sent up to what's now called Fort Fizzle up Lolo Creek to stop the Nez Perce from coming over. And if you're familiar with that story, in Missoula, my family and my friends and the whole town essentially was on alert, because no one knew which way they would turn if they came up through Missoula. And a reminder, these were 2 months earlier had been our friends. I mean, I had wandered through the camps, played with the Indian boys, etc. And now they were all coming this way and basically on the warpath as we were portrayed. Now, Missoula was a small town. The metropolis back then was Deer Lodge. The closest telegraph office was in Deer Lodge. So the dispatches that we were receiving, they basically Pony Express to Fort Missoula and to Missoula to tell us what was going on over in Idaho. So it was a scary time, and we had in Missoula they had set up all the brick buildings, and there was what they called the brick block. They still call it the brick block downtown, that included the Warden and Company store, Higgins and Warden, and also the first story of what became the Missoula Mercantile. These were going to be our refuge points if the Nez Perce came to town. Well, my dad was part of the packers that were servicing the military. He and others were on their way with mules out to Fort Fizzle. They got in the Cold Springs area, and this older gentleman, and I wish I could think of his name. It started with one-armed Johnson, let's say. He was also not very. His eyesight wasn't very good. he mistook these mule trains for going out to Fort Fizzle for the Indians coming in. He jumps on his horse, and of course we're all on high alert, and heads into town. The Indians are coming, the Indians are coming, the whole Paul Revere thing. And here I am with a couple of my buddies. We're swimming in the river, the Clark Fork or the Hellgate River, Missoula River, at the south end of Higgins Avenue Bridge when old One-Armed Johnson comes into town. Immediately throw on our clothes, and everybody in town that had guns grabs their guns, heads for wherever they were going to head for, whether it was the Merc or their own homes. And for hours, Missoula is waiting for the imminent arrival of the Nez Perce on the warpath. Now again, think of this as, these were my friends 2 months ago, and now they're the savages that are coming through to destroy our town or whatever we thought they were going to do. Turned out it was a false alarm. As you probably know, the Nez Perce turned up the Bitterroot, headed up towards Hamilton, over the pass, eventually got caught, and the Big Hole battle took place there. I was in 1921, so almost 40 years later, I wrote a long account of this for the Missoulian, and in that I made it clear that that my sources for the details of all this and the Battle of the Big Hole, other than my own personal memories of swimming in the river, came from people that were actually in the battle. Somehow between 1921 and 1954, when I died, it got into my obituary at that time that I was a 14-year-old volunteer in the Battle of the Big Hole. And later historians, me, thought, "Whoa, that's a good story. I better do this guy for Stories and Stones." But as I researched it, I found out that even though it was in the obituary for Will Cave in 1954, that couldn't have been true. He never mentioned any personal experience actually at the battle. Gave a lot of details based on a distant uncle named John Catlin, who headed all the volunteers in this. Long story short, Poker Joe Looking Glass, who was leading the band that was coming back from the hunting grounds in May, died when the Nez Perce were caught at the Bear Paws in September and October of that year. The last buffalo hunt, the last time that they would go east of the mountains as a tribe and come back and celebrate in Missoula, was that year when I was a 13-year-old boy. It was the end of an era. The buffalo were gone in 6 years, and we went on to other things in Missoula's history, but that was a sad chapter, I guess, at that time. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.